In the rural mountains of a country unidentified to mankind lived a boy named George. You see, George had a very interesting childhood. George was an only child to a mother and a father. And he was always the lowest rung of his family, of his town, of his country. He wasn't very strong. He wasn't very tall. He wasn't particularly smart, nor was he very good at socializing. But there was one thing that George was good at. What was that, Austin?
George was exceptional at swimming. He was the lead swimmer in all of the state, the country. He was known as one of the best swimmers that the country has ever seen. Now, because he was so good at that and so bad at everything else, well, people perceived him to be bad at everything else. He developed a large chip on his shoulder. And maybe whenever he left the pool, he was not seen as the best of the best. But when he got in it, he was the best. So, whenever he would go against the competition in the pool and he would destroy them, it developed not only an angel on his shoulder, but a devil on his shoulder. And as he progressed and started to get better and better at swimming, the devil talking to him became louder and louder, telling him that he was the best, telling him that he is the one, telling him that he is chosen and is the chosen one to be the most successful from his rural town and the country that he's in. So as time progressed, that molded George into what one might say would be an egotistical man. But along the way, he encountered a girl. And how did he meet this girl, Jose?
So when George's ego was starting to burn beyond the point of passion and fire, he got kicked out of his house by his dad. One night, after a particularly grueling practice, George had an attitude with his mother because she wanted his help. And George thought to himself, I don't need to help you. I'm the best swimmer in this town. I need to rest and I need food. I don't need you and your attitude, Mom. George's father kicked him out. George is wandering the small rural village, frustrated, angry, lost. What did I do wrong? I'm the best of the best. There's nothing that I can't do if I'm in the pool. And as George continues to walk, he stumbles into a coffee shop. Now, George has never been one for coffee, but he figured perhaps this is something that I can dabble in today because I've heard that a good cup of coffee can take the sorrows away. A beautiful girl by the name of Maria comes to his side, gives him his cup of coffee and says, "Hey, aren't you that guy, the best swimmer from our town that's going to go into the Olympics?" Yeah, it's you. He says, "I guess that's me." "Well, what's wrong? What's wrong, George?" Maria sits down next to George, and George is getting this feeling. The angel on his shoulder is kind of illuminating him. And he doesn't quite understand the feeling that he has in his heart and his stomach and his brain sure as hell can't process what's going on. And George leaves there with a new perspective. The seed of the new perspective has been planted in his life. He goes home. His father lets him in as he admits himself for being wrong, apologizes to his mother, and as he sleeps, a transformation undergoes in his mind. Walk us through his thoughts, Austin.
So as George lay there, sleep on a relatively cold night, the rain starts to trickle down, and he starts to think and meditate on his previous transgressions. And as he thinks, he realizes that the person that who he thought he was in the pool was not the person that everyone saw him as. However, it is, or it was, the person that Maria saw him as. So, as he went throughout the night, vivid images of Maria popped up in his mind that has started to progress into more vivid images that made George say to himself, I believe this is the woman for me. So as he awakes of his vivid dreams of Maria, he goes and gets ready for his swim practice in the morning. And as he goes to swim practice, it's almost like every other girl out there didn't matter. All he could think about was Maria. During his swim practice, all he could think about was Maria. But as he's pondering on the girl that stole his heart, he hears a whistle that wakes him up from his daydream. And he realizes, wait a second, why is my coach yelling at me? So he looks up at his coach, and he looks to his left, and he looks to his right, and his teammates are laughing. And he's wondering why they're laughing. And once the thing clicks in his mind, he realizes that he lost. Not only did he get second, no, he didn't even get third. Wait. He was in fourth place? George? The best in the town, the best in the country at swimming, lost? But he's the best. So he thought. But he realized that Maria, who he cared for so much after knowing her for so shortly, was starting to impede who he thought he was as the best swimmer. So, after this humiliation, he had to choose. Am I who I say I am? And will I be who I believe I am? Or am I going to push that to the side to pursue Maria? And Jose, can you walk us through what he did next?
George turned in his goggles, never to return to competitive swimming again. George went to the cafe, confessed his love to Maria. And for the rest of that year, George was a mess. You see, George thought that everything would be fine and life would be fine. And being with Maria would solve all his problems. But in reality, those problems didn't go away. In that year, George changed his entire life trajectory. And George had to learn how to make maps of meaning. George had to learn how to build from zero. George had to learn how to balance a relationship. George had to learn how to make money. George had to learn how to function in society, how to provide value. George had to learn how to be a man. And by the end of the year, George had his first child. But looking back, at the end of that year, holding his firstborn at the bedside next to Maria, George had one thought. Why didn't I do this earlier? I never cared about the accolades. I never cared about the perceived popularity. I never cared about any of that. That doesn't hold the candle to this moment. Me holding my first child next to my wife. And George thought to himself, that's life. Austin.
Yes, sir.
Ego is the enemy.
Is it now?
Oh, shout out to Ryan Holiday. Ego is the enemy. That's where this story and podcast topic was inspired from. Just so y'all know, Austin, bring him up to speed on that magnificent story.
So, for those that may not be privy, which all of you are not privy by this, well, actually, fast forward into the future, somebody may see this episode after seeing this becoming a large thing that we do. But Jose and I basically put together this story on the spot to illustrate what we're going to podcast about today. Ego is the enemy. And this is something that George clearly went through in the story, but most of you are probably going through on a day-to-day basis, and you may not even know it. So when we say ego is the enemy, Jose, what are we talking about?
Ego has the potential to derail you and completely guide you in the wrong direction from where you are actually meant to go. Ego sometimes plays a deceptive role, which is what we saw in the case of George. Ego will sometimes make you burn other people. Ego will sometimes consume you to the point where there is no return. And once you give in to ego, you essentially burn to your demise. Now, there is an opposite case to be said, but this story was a tale of what oftentimes happens in today's society, where we focus on accolades, we focus on attention, we focus on areas where only we excel so that we can feel our meaningless existence is meaningful. What are your thoughts?
So, I agree with you. And that was an example of how getting rid of your ego can make room for more fulfilling things in life. However, I do think that there's a second part to that story that we didn't tell. And I hate using this, but like a different universe, one could say, where George chose himself and not Maria. And what happens when one does that? and they're committed, you would say, sure, they could be seen as a bit of a narcissist, but I would say that having an ego as an ally as opposed to as an enemy could take you to new heights when it comes to achieving things that you say that you want to. And as an example, when you're at the bottom and you don't think highly of yourself, it's hard for you to climb up. What motivation do you have? What reason do you have to climb up? But if you're at the bottom and you have an ego and you say, hey, look, I don't care what anybody says. My name is Michael Jordan. I may not have made my high school varsity team, but I know I'm him. I'm gonna try out again. I'm gonna make it, and then I'm gonna go to the NBA. I would say, in that case, and we all know Michael Jordan and people like him to be kind of egotistical, but I also believe that has served them to be the best of the best when it comes to whatever it is that they do. In this case, basketball. In George's case, swimming. In our case, everything. But I do
Humbly
believe,
so.
yeah, at least I'll fuck with you. But I do believe that it's a two-sided coin. You have the side where you relinquish ego and it is the enemy, and you can go the route that George ended up taking. But however, you can also choose making ego your ally. And I believe that it can get you into some pretty interesting places, positively, I might add, that you may not have gotten otherwise.
I think that ego is simultaneously one of the most powerful forces to motivate you and one of the most powerful forces that can wreck you.
Agreed.
I think ego is like the ultimate pill of power. It can put you in an incredible position, and it can also put you in the worst position possible. The best way that I could describe ego is what fuels you. As hearkening back to that podcast, I don't know what number it is, but that's fine. Essentially, you might have let's walk through George's alternate universe. So when George got kicked out of the house, instead of going to the cafe, or even going to the cafe, talking to Maria told him a couple things about life that he did not agree with at all. That actually made him even more pissed off. And instead of going home, George went to the gym. George got in the pool. And George swam until practice started. In the morning, George finished practice and stayed in the gym. That's all he did. George slept in the gym on the floor. It was swim, sleep, swim, sleep, swim, sleep, swim, sleep. That same year, George made the Olympic team. The first Olympics came 2 years later, and George won the gold medal in his first event ever. George went on to finish his career 25 years later, holding the most world records in gold medals in his class, in his race. George retired at the age of 50, single, unmarried, no children. But George then traveled the world. Being the best swimmer of his time, George was known from corner to corner. George was beloved. George became a motivational speaker. George became a very interesting machine. He couldn't stop. And he continued and continued and continued. Eventually, George did get married and have kids. did not spend too much time with them, but he loved his wife and his wife loved him. But George knows nothing of his mother. George knows nothing of his father. But he's the world champ and the best of his time. George won by an objective standpoint. And for some people, that is their reality. They sacrifice everything for one thing. And that's perfectly fine if that's what you choose to do. But just know there's a cost. As Austin says, it costs to be the boss. And sometimes you have to make sacrifices that other people are unwilling to make in order for you to get to where other people cannot get to. And that is a very hard pill to swallow. But if you are the kind of person who will make those sacrifices and those decisions, hats off to you. But I want to make it clear that's not for everybody, and that's perfectly fine. To each their own, truly.
And you have to realize that ego is like an axe. You can cut down trees with that axe that could provide warmth for those that need it, paper for those that need it, oxygen. We need oxygen. Can't live without that. But exactly, but cutting down the trees can provide a lot, houses, all that stuff. But you also have to realize that if you use the axe, it can also be used for harm. Mm. So it's an axe. You have to realize what you're wielding when you wield it. And as you're wielding this ego, you have to realize that you have a very powerful thing in your hands. It can take you to the highest of heights, but it can also take you to the lowest of lows. And you have to be observant of this fact, because if you're not, more often than not, it's going to take you to the lowest of lows. And I would say the people who do succeed and who reach higher heights are people who realize that it's an axe and realize that, hey, I can use this as fuel to get me to higher heights. However, those that don't realize this, those that don't realize that they are holding this powerful tool in their hands, more often than not, misuse it. They use it for the wrong things. They don't use it to cut down trees and build houses. They use it to tear down and destroy. And when you use it to tear down and destroy, more often than not, you will be a victim of the very thing that you use on others. So that ego that you force upon others and that you make others bend the knee to will more often than not be the very thing that takes you out in the end. For those who love war, in the end, they may probably have died or succumbed to injuries due to that very thing. You live by the sword, you die by the sword.
And what's interesting about that analogy, the cutting of the trees, in order to build with those trees that you cut or use them for resources, you have to devastate the ecosystem that the trees provide. One oak tree houses squirrels, birds, insects. It gives nitrogen to the fungi that's growing under it. It helps shade small little shrubs that grow under them. An oak provides bountifully. But in order to use that oak as firewood, as wood for a house, furniture, what have you, anything, you have to devastate the entirety of that ecosystem. To say there's an opportunity cost for you to live the life that you want is an understatement. But there's also an opportunity cost for you to stay in the life that you want. And the devil that you don't know isn't always better than the devil you do, and vice versa. It's always a tricky barrier to play with.
And I think for my perspective on things, it might be different than most of you, and yours might be different. But for me, I love Ryan Holiday. I love the book. But to me, ego is the enemy if you're not smart enough to make it an ally. If you don't know how to make an enemy an ally, it is an enemy for you. But if you figure out how to make peace with someone who has your worst interest at heart, you can't make it an ally. And what we have figured out and what we use is that we have understood how to make that enemy an ally. We know how to make truce, how to make peace with that enemy so that we can use them and they can use us. The ego can be used by us to do powerful things, but it also uses us because it relishes in the fact that we think so highly of ourselves. Now, for those out there, I would say most people don't know how to do that or don't want to do that. However, for us, I believe it works, and it works very well. But, Jose, you would have to give me your opinion on that, because I think that's how, at least I know, I utilize it.
I couldn't find what I was looking for. Essentially, Robert Greene in the 48 Laws of Power says that your best ally is who your previous enemy was, because they've relinquished their resistance to you, and now they're actually in your debt. They have something to prove to you that they previously didn't have. Right. They spent all this time trying to get you to achieve your own demise and to lead you astray, but you accepted them and made them an ally. And now they have all the reason to prove you otherwise and why they should be there with you, helping you, which means they will try even harder to get to where you need to. In other words, using your enemy as a footstool. Use your ego. Your ego is your enemy until it becomes your ally, but when it becomes your ally, it is your greatest ally. The ego doubles, triples, amplifies every single process that you take care of. Your ego is the most potent fuel in the world, and a smart man, a smart woman knows how to channel that ego, because ego is energy, and energy can be used for forward progression or reverse progression. You decide, my friend.
The AM Club Podcast.
Signing out.
Mic check. The AM Club Podcast.